I'm going to start off with asking you a little bit about CuriousWorks itself. Your organization focus on working with several different communities and communicating their stories to the rest of Australia. So could you start off by telling us about how that all began and why you felt the need to bring these stories to the rest of the community?
Sure. One reason I set up CuriousWorks is because of what I think digital media can offer communities that don't usually have the opportunity to tell their own stories. But I wanted to do that in a best practice way. So when we work with communities, we don't go in as documentary artists or as artists who are there to take their stories and put them into our own productions. Our focus is to collaborate with them equally and actually teach them the skills to tell their own stories. We do also collaborate with them to create professional art productions, but alongside that process, we're teaching them how to tell their own story, particularly through digital media.
Okay. So you work a lot with refugees and asylum seekers, both from Sri Lanka as well as from other parts of the world. So how has that been? How does that communicating their stories fit into this, fit into your larger sort of objective and vision?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So one of the things that we do is we focus on working with communities that don't otherwise have the opportunity to tell their stories. And so in a country like Australia, which is very multicultural, is a kind of Western style democracy, the communities that tend to have less cultural rights tend to be those, many of the Indigenous communities to Australia don't have the same levels of cultural rights as other communities, but also many of the migrant and refugee communities don't have those same levels of cultural rights. So naturally, we've been drawn to working with quite a lot of communities that are Indigenous to Australia, the Aboriginal people of Australia, and also refugee communities. In terms of working with refugees, we found that it's been important for a number of reasons. Firstly, because Australia actually has a history that's based in migration. And so for Australia as a multicultural society, the more we work with refugee communities, the more we're able to tell stories of how migration and arrival are part of Australia's history. And subtly, we're actually saying that about Anglo-Celtic communities as well. So in helping refugees tell their own stories, we're also reminding Anglo-Celtic communities that may have come 200 years ago that they too came as migrants, and they too, if they're from a convict history, came as refugees from Britain. And so it's able to reshape the way we look at Australian history and see that we have a constant refugee process, and that those who are coming from, say, Sri Lanka and Iraq now are only the most recent refugees. And that should be a proud part of our history rather than one which we're dismayed by or we see as contentious. Specifically, though, the refugee issue has become something that's quite politicized in the last, certainly 10 years, but especially in the last 5 or 6 years. And as a company, we don't take political sides in that, but we do feel that the voice that's least represented in that political debate is actually the voice of those who have been through those experiences. And so instead of people making decisions about how they feel about refugee issues based on a kind of separate context where they just look at it as commentary and other people, they're able to actually have some empathy with refugees and hear their story from the inside out and think about it in a different way. Now, most people in Australia from a Western background, just say refugee however they want, and they talk about refugees all the time, and they don't really think about what that might mean for the person who's being called that. So these are the kinds of changes in perception and perspective that we want to bring out in the everyday Australian who sees our shows or comes to our shows and actually is able to hear the refugee story told by themselves.
So one of your works with regard to refugees, I think you worked on this in 2011, was The Other Journey. So could you tell us a little bit about that? What was the reaction to it? How did
The Other Journey was cool. What happened was audiences came to a river and a riverbank. It was in Parramatta, in a place where a significant proportion of people who've come as refugees from Sri Lanka have settled in this area in Australia. And there's big spice shops in this area, and there's a lot of Sri Lankans on the streets and things like that. Instead of a traditional space where the audience sit in particular seats and look at a performance. The audience instead are all given headphones and MP3 players, and they listen to stories from Sri Lankan refugees set to music on these headphones and these MP3 players. And while they do that on the river and on the riverbank. So half the show takes place on a boat, and half the show takes place on the riverbank in Parramatta River. And what that means is that the audience aren't separate from the stories they're listening to, but physically stepping through a similar process to what they're listening to on the headphones. So at the beginning of the show, the group is divided into two. So often friends who come to the show together actually experience the show in those two different groups. And they see their friends leave on the boat to listen to one half of the show, and they stay on the riverbank, and then they see them come back and they swap. So like that, we take the audience through a process of being divided and reunified through the process of actually having to go on a journey and come back. And we make them think about that. Obviously, it's nowhere near the same, of course, as a refugee journey, but in that way, we actually make them step through and think about what it means to journey and see friends go and see your friends come back, or never see your friends again. So we like to look at different ways that artistic productions can happen. We like to look at contemporary art processes that I guess are more fitting for the kinds of stories we look at than traditional modes of artistic production.
Okay. So Shakthi has one last question. As I mentioned before, the topic is a very sort of difficult topic, particularly in Australia, where I've seen an increase in trend of asylum seekers, particularly from Sri Lanka. So how has the response been so far? Like, have you been able to communicate what you wanted to communicate to the audiences?
Yeah, I think if I could bring up Villawood Mums here, if that's okay. What Villawood Mums did is put forward two young men who interviewed their mums about their experience, their mum's experience in Villawood Hostel and then Villawood Detention Centre, and allowed audiences to make up their own minds. And what was great about that is we shared that on places like Facebook and our own website and things like that. And what was great about that is there were people, for example, who didn't realise how much it had changed. And so we had one person who said on Facebook that after watching that Villawood Mums, they were interested in what the current experience for refugees was. They were going to go visit the detention centre and also talk to their own community. I think it was a church in this person's case, about how their conditions had changed, and start a conversation with them about that. So when you use universal themes like sons interviewing their mums, and when you put the human story forward, you're able to get into people's minds in a way that trying to make an open political statement doesn't, if that makes sense. And you're able to allow people to think about the story and as if they're thinking about it themselves, and for them to make up their own minds rather than them feeling like they're being told to think a certain way about refugees. The other important thing with that was that it was these guys telling their own stories. So even though we do see documentaries on RTV channels about refugees, very rarely are they made by people who've been through that process themselves. The Sri Lankan thing is interesting because the stage we're at with it now is actually talking to our own community. I'm Sri Lankan as well. I'm a Sri Lankan Australian, and my family left in '83 because where we lived and our families were affected by the riots, and we were affected by those riots, and they felt it wasn't safe. But some of my family stayed in Sri Lanka, as with a lot of diasporic families, and they've decided to stay there. And we've got family across the world now. But again, I don't know how sensitive this is for you guys, but in Australia, there needs to be work done first and foremost with the Sri Lankan community here before we even reach out further to the Australian public. And so part of that has to do with the Tamil community especially coming to terms with what the Tamil Tigers did, as much as coming to terms with what various parts of the government did in Sri Lanka, and finding a new path forward which looks at the diaspora playing a healthy role in both the future of those communities in Australia, but also the future of Sri Lanka. And so that's not a simple thing to do, but the arts is a really good way of starting discussion around that process. So our focus with recent refugees from Sri Lanka has actually been about them creating stories that the rest of the Sri Lankan community can see and respond to. And that's been a really positive process thus far. So the other journey and the other films that I was talking to you about, with the looking at the UN saying, war crimes are being committed and so on, half the audience for those shows was actually other Sri Lankan Australians. And a lot of the discussion that came from that and perceptions that were changed were actually about the Sri Lankan community in Australia. And it was about us trying to find a healthier way as a diaspora to work with you guys and the community in Sri Lanka so that we're all moving forward to a peaceful reconciliation.